My name's Robbie Luckett. I'm director of the Margaret Walker Center and professor of history at Jackson State University. Today is Monday, October 25th, 2021. It's approximately 9:06 a.m. Central Time. I'm here with Dina Bailey today. Dina, for the purposes of our interview, will you state and spell your name for us?
Sure. My name is Dina Bailey, spelled Dina Bailey.
And do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes, you do.
Let's begin with some background information on you, some biographical info. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you grew up, what your family life was like, where you went to school, those kinds of things.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My family is all from Ohio. My dad grew up in Cleveland. My mom grew up in Columbus. So very much an Ohio girl. I grew up in the suburbs of Cincinnati, so in a majority white community, large school system. There were about 345 students in my class. So thinking about how large that was for the entire school. Of that, just because I'm thinking along racial lines, I think that there were only 4 other Black students in that class of 345. So you can kind of imagine perhaps what that was like. I grew up in that suburb all the way through schooling. And then I went to Butler University in Indianapolis, so private school within the city. The numbers were likely about the same, right, in terms of percentage. So certainly more students, I think twice as many students, but percentages were about the same there. I got an undergrad degree in middle and secondary education and was a high school English teacher for 2 years. In Indianapolis in one of the public schools there. And then I moved to England to get my master's in anthropology of development and social transformation. So I did a lot of work in genocide prevention, also healing and reconciliation work. And that brought me back to, or brought me to, I guess, the museum field. So I worked at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then I worked at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia. And then I went out on my own. So I own my own consulting firm called Mountaintop Vision, and I live in Atlanta still. So I've had my consulting firm since 2016. And in 2017, I think, I also started working with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. I worked with them for 2 years before going back solely on my own to Mountaintop Vision. Good.
Yeah, you covered a lot of ground in a few short minutes. Let's go back to your education. When you were particularly in England doing your master's, what was it that made you begin to think about opportunities in the museum field? What brought you there?
Yes, I will be embarrassed by this, but I still always share this story. I didn't know what to write my thesis on. And so I was talking to my aunt and she said, well, you should write about museums. And I told her that museums were like glorified libraries. But I didn't have anything else to talk about. And so I ended up doing some research into museums, exhibitions specifically. And I ended up writing about how you can impact and influence how people think about African art based on the way that it is curated in an exhibition. So thinking about the art itself, the artist, where the artist comes from, and how that ripples out, that impact ripples out. So that's how I really got started in museums.
And what was it that brought you back to Cincinnati into the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center?
Sure. When I left grad school, I figured that I had 2 options. I could really use the lessons that I had learned and go back to teaching. I actually had a potential job in North Carolina, doing the same thing I had been doing before, just in a different place and with some more knowledge. So that was one of my opportunities. The other opportunity was returning home to Cincinnati, where the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center had been open for about 4 years, and they were doing a curatorial fellowship. And so they were doing a 2-year fellowship during which you get paid. I had a housing stipend. They did a museum studies certification, and I worked full time. And so I ended up deciding that rather than going back to something I had already done with new knowledge, I wanted to do something totally new and blend both my education and my graduate degree together. So that's sort of how I ended up home in Cincinnati, but particularly with the Freedom Center.
So what did the curatorial fellowship actually look like, and what did the museum studies certification entail?
Yeah, so when I was at the Freedom Center, I was one of the early fellows. So there were several after me, and I think it looked a little bit different. But I was there for 2 years. I started in the exhibitions department. We didn't have a purely curatorial team. I started in exhibitions mostly because of my thesis work. And then I quickly moved around. So I had reported into my supervisor for 2 weeks before she resigned. So then I started reporting directly to the director of education, exhibitions, and programs. Within the year, he resigned. So then I started reporting directly to the CEO. So it was basically like I was working, well, museums, we work like 60 hours a week, right? So I was working my 60 hours a week. I was learning about museums, just holding my feet to the flames. The museum studies program was at University of Cincinnati, and it was really focused on art. And so I had to translate a lot of what I was learning into history and culture. It was still good, right? I think it was good to have a certification, but I would say I did a lot of translating for myself. It wasn't necessarily geared toward me or people like me in my position. So that's kind of museum studies. Going back to the curatorial fellowship altogether, I didn't mention that I also had an externship 1 year. So I was at the Reginald F. Lewis in Baltimore for a couple of months and did some work with them. And then in addition to all of the work happening at the Freedom Center and the Museum Studies program and that externship, they had also made money set aside for conferences. So that's actually how I originally got involved in American Alliance of Museums, American Association for State and Local History, and AAAM. Those were the first conferences that I went to, and I stuck around after that.
So yeah, you do this, sounds like very robust curatorial fellowship, and some remarkable experiences that kept you quite busy. And I know you said you then eventually moved to Atlanta and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. What was that transition like, and what were you doing in Atlanta?
So when I was at the Freedom Center, I had those 2 years. I said I was reporting into the CEO pretty early on in that time. Also keeping in mind that it had been open for only 4 years ahead. So I went into that curatorial position not knowing that they'd never done a real temporary exhibition. They'd never done an in-house exhibition. They'd never done updates to their permanent exhibition. So I did a lot of those things in those first couple of years, partly because I didn't know any better. They were like, yeah, we need to do this. And I said, sure. So I learned a lot from that experience. Also during that time, we ended up merging with the Cincinnati Museum Center. So our two organizations were really different. The Freedom Center, nationally focused, some would say an African American museum, others maybe not so much, focused on the abolition movement and enslavement in the US, as well as contemporary slavery. A lot of people of color worked on that staff. It was a smaller staff, as opposed to the Cincinnati Museum Center, which was basically the opposite. It was regional in nature. It was one of those that had a natural history museum, a children's museum, an IMAX theater, all of those things, hundreds of employees, mostly white, right? So by the time that merger was done, I had been at the Freedom Center for 6 years. We had done the merger. I had done a lot of things personally. I also had I think it's 4 CEOs in those 6 years. So I was exhausted. And I decided that I wanted to look for something different. I had curated an exhibition called Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. It was owned by the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. And so I happened to call up the CEO there and I said, hey, I'm going to start looking for a job, just wanted to let folks know. And his name is Doug Shipman. And he said, hey, remember, I'm building a museum in Atlanta. Do you want to come down? And so within the month, I had done all of my interviews. I had moved to Atlanta. Doug was the only person that I knew. And I was there 6 months before the Center for Civil and Human Rights opened. So once I got to Atlanta, I was really building relationships, community partnerships, doing a collections plan, lots of new things at the center here in Atlanta.
That Without Sanctuary exhibit was a really remarkable one that when it traveled actually came to Jackson State for a period of time, actually long before I got here. But I had a chance to see it in Atlanta, and I still use Without Sanctuary itself. And my classes at Jackson State, what a remarkable, powerful thing to have worked on. We've heard others talk about the merger of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center with the Cincinnati Museum Center. We've had some of your past colleagues from there in some of these oral histories. That was a pretty controversial decision, and it must have been a tumultuous time to be there when all of that went down. What was that like?
I would definitely say controversial and tumultuous. Those are two really good words for it. I often wonder, with hindsight being 2020, what the board, both of the boards would have made the same decision or a different decision. I think that both organizations were hurting financially, but in other ways as well. One of those, the Freedom Center, was more visibly hurting, I think, than the other. And so there was an advantage to that, I would say, for the Cincinnati Museum Center. I think that the conversations that I was in, certainly from the senior leadership team side, which I was on, as well as some of those board conversations, really did get to identity. And so you heard me talking about demographics and focus and some of those other things. I remember a moment in one of the conversations where an individual, I will say on the board, said to some effect, I would rather see the Freedom Center stop existing than go into the hands of a white organization, basically, right? And that decision was discussed, or that feeling was discussed, and a different decision ultimately was made, as we know. But I think that if people could go back, they would more seriously consider what that individual was saying. It was a hard decision for both the senior team and the boards to make. I think that there are still a lot of tensions and struggles because of that. And also, ultimately, both organizations are still in existence.
So you end up in Atlanta. Tell us more about what your job was at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and what your work was like there specifically.
Yeah, I was the inaugural director of educational strategies. I came on thinking I would get to build a team, which would be amazing, but it was really just me for a long time, as happens. I was also one of the few, at times, the only person with museum experience, which I think is another thing that folks don't always consider. And so I was often the one who was saying, no, we can't sell our artwork. Oh no, we can't do this other thing. So often I was the naysayer, but also the person to set some standards. And so generally that was my role on the senior team there. I would say specifically in terms of educational strategies, I was there again 6 months before we opened. So a lot of the exhibitions had already been set and were being placed. My job was to come in, see the challenge areas, and then figure out how to interpret them, work with the curators to make them clearer, more accessible. So ultimately responsible for the tours, the trainings of docents, responsible for all of the K to 12 and college relationships. So again, a lot of relationship building, but was really responsible for the community engagement and programming in those first couple of years. And so I'm not exaggerating when I say I did 345 programs in that first year. Right. A lot of that, again, was not me solely. There were a ton of partnerships because people wanted to partner with the center. But we were doing multiple programs a day, focusing on how to get as many people into the museum as possible. So that was my job. Again, those 60 hours became 80 hours for the 2 years that I was there.
You live that kind of job. It's not just a 9 to 5 that you clock in for.
Yes.
So you're there for 2 years. You're obviously burning the candle at both ends. And you've then leave and take the path to where you are now. Can you talk a little bit more about that path to where you are now and what you do today on a day-to-day basis?
When I was at the center, as you said, I was burning the candle at both ends. That is probably the theme of my life, that I work really hard and burn myself out and then move somewhere else, recognizing that the grass isn't always greener, it's just different grass, right? So I think that is partially my personality anyway. But at the end of my time, closing in on the end of my time at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, a couple of things were happening. One of the really important things I think that was happening was that Doug Shipman, the founding CEO, announced that he was leaving. And so then there was an interim, and then there was a second CEO. And so in that 2 year period, I technically had 3 CEOs as bosses, right? Also, the finances were not as strong, I think, as initially predicted for the Center for Civil and Human Rights. And so they sort of went back and forth, crossing into the red and the black, into the red, which was what the Freedom Center had done for the entirety that I was there. And there were a couple of other things that I was just in my mind saying, I've been here, I've done this. The Freedom Center is about 10 years ahead, 6 years ahead, but I've already played this game. So I decided it was time to leave and do something different. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works in South Carolina at Historic Columbia. We were at the South Carolina State Museum Conference. And I was talking to her there because I was a panelist, and I said I was probably going to leave. And she said she had some work for me to do. And so she was my first client, Historic Columbia. And I had about 3 other clients that kind of happened from there. But I will say, I did feel like I jumped out of a plane without a parachute. And it took a while. So at first I played mind games, right? I told myself I was on vacation. And then I was like, I have to do something impactful. So then I pretended I was on sabbatical. And then I had a couple of jobs. So I was like, I'm working part-time. It's fine. Until I started working, had enough to work full-time hours. And that wasn't too long, right? We'll say 6 to 8 months, but it felt really long. And so with those first couple of organizations that I worked with, they were all friends. All had thought about the work that I had done at the 2 institutions. So primarily focusing on race, diversity, equity, those kinds of things, but from the experience that I had in programming, in facilitation, in strategic planning. And that's really where my business was founded and where it continues. So I have a heart for diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, anti-racism, certainly, but that spreads throughout a lot of different things: trainings, coaching, facilitation, exhibition advisement, right? Lots of different things. I will say just very quickly that when I started, I worked with organizations that were already further along on their journey, right? Eastern State Penitentiary, talked to folks at Whitney Plantation, right? Those kinds of places. Once I had started working, and I'll say currently, I work with many more organizations that are just starting out on their journey. And so I think that's valuable in that I got to see where some folks were, which is inspiring, and then go backwards on organizational journey to help folks get to those spots, if that makes sense.
Makes complete sense. So what is the name of your company so that we have that for the record?
Of course, the name of my company is Mountaintop Vision. Mountaintop Vision. So I will, of course, say that Martin Luther King Jr. inspired that name, but also I like the idea of thinking about journeys. And so I'm often using the visuals of going on a journey, what you need to do to prepare, how hard that journey may be, thinking about maps, right? All of those things. Once you get to the top and you see the view, you still have to come back down. So it started with MLK, certainly, but the journey is really the important part for me.
So when you consult with someone like an organization like Whitney Plantation, not too far from us here in Jackson, over in Louisiana, what does that consultation look like? What does that actual kind of daily interaction with an organization like that look like? That's doing remarkable work in terms of how do we interpret stories that have traditionally been dominated from a white kind of old South antebellum perspective, right? The Gone with the Wind perspective.
When I think about organizations like that, I'll center it in the past couple of years just because it is really contextual, right? What people need is based on what's happening in the moment. And so I think for organizations that are already along on their journey, it is a recognition, a frustration, a confusion, perhaps about why so many other folks aren't as far along on their journey, right? And how we think about empathy and grace and stretching people, but not scaring them so much that they shut the door in our faces, right? So I think for organizations that are further along, it's thinking about all of those things, how we nuance and continue to push and not let not let the defensiveness of some folks who visit get in the way, right, of what we're trying to do. And a lot of that has to do with how we ask questions, what questions we ask, and how we do self-care, right? So I think that's really important. So for those organizations, and I would add in the 9/11 Museum, right? I would add in Historic Columbia, who I've already worked with, Ohio History Connection in Ohio. A lot of those places have been thinking about this, but now are getting really frustrated, I would say, with folks who want to debate the definition of race, right? To say, yeah, we think that we're at level 500 and we're really at level 50, right? Not even at 101 yet. So I think that that gap is where a lot of those organizations are really focusing.
Do you have a guiding kind of philosophy when it comes to dealing with topics like these? I mean, I especially think in the context of the Black Museum movement, particularly post George Floyd, how often Black museums and museum professionals are called in to be arbiters of these discussions in spaces that are very, very complicated. I'm just wondering, again, if you have kind of a guiding philosophy to your approach and how you encourage people to deal with these kinds of topics.
I have so many thoughts about it. One of the things that I will acknowledge is that, and this hopefully doesn't sound like a martyr, I feel like I often put myself in those spaces so that other people of color don't have to be in those spaces, right? So I said, now I'm working with a lot of organizations that are at the beginning of their journey. And in that, then folks ask me questions and folks say things to me that I've opened myself up to, right? But I do so partly so they're not asking those questions or saying those things to other folks. So I think that there's that. I also recognize for especially people of color, as we're talking about this, that there is no mandate that you have to do it, that you have to say, that you have to participate. And sometimes for survival, sometimes for self-care, right? We just need to pull ourselves back, I think. I also am pretty realistic about the fact that lots of people of color move jobs, not just because they can't get ahead, but because they're tired of the work that they're having to do in these spaces. So I think, when I talk to some of my Black colleagues, it's a recognition that you stay for as long as you can, and it's okay to leave as well, right? You're not quitting, you're not a failure if you decide to leave a particular place. I talk a lot with leaders about what equity means, because I have a lot of clients who want equality in terms of training, right? Everyone gets exactly the same thing, but everyone doesn't need exactly the same thing. And so inevitably, when there are questions and concerns that come up, we put into practice empathy, we put into practice equity. And I would just try to say that I work toward lifting others as I climb, right? Particularly for colleagues of color, being able to say the things or ask the questions or answer so that I can give them a little bit of breathing space in the organizations that they're currently attached to.
What are the biggest challenges you faced in doing that kind of work?
I am also exhausted. I think that when I don't know, the first couple of years that I was doing the work, I thought that I was just facilitating. So I used to imagine that all of the things that people say come in one ear and go out the other, right? And I had a moment, I forget now when, but a couple of years ago, when I realized that I was more like a sponge that certainly the water comes in and it goes back out, but it still leaves the sponge kind of dirty, right? It's kind of grungy. And so thinking about that for myself was really important. I also used to be not a lot more understanding, I think, than I am understanding, but I think I used to give a lot more grace before George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and all of the people who have lost their lives in the past couple of years. And so I've really had to look at myself and how I feel as an individual Black woman, and look at my work and how I work, right, in this space. And I think that I didn't, unfortunately, think about that. I just thought those two things were the same before these past 2 years, and I've really separated them out, I think, in the past 2 years.
So the flip side of that question is, what are the rewards in doing this work, and why do you keep doing it?
Some of the rewards, I think, are just the people who are searching and questioning and curious, the people who are affirmed. I never had the words for this, but now I do. Now I see myself. I see someone who's doing these things. I also will say that I used to go into spaces and think that I could change people. And now I very much am like, I create opportunities, right? Certainly. But in a 2-hour period and a 6-month period, I'm not changing you unless you want to be changed, right? And so I very much think of myself as creating opportunities. That is a success measure for me. And I very much think about moving individuals. And so every time that I see a spark or somebody sends me an email later, I know that there has been a ripple impact. And so that's what really keeps me going.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit as we come towards the end of this conversation, you had mentioned about attending AAAM, the Association of African American Museums, for the first time, the first conference that you went to, I guess, during your curatorial fellowship. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experience and history with AAAM?
Sure. And you can always help me out with that too. I went to, from first time, so say to AAAM consistently. I saw it sort of what I've been talking about, a place to come together and just see people like me and affirm that we are in this space and visible and doing work. I thought that was really important, and saw it really as a networking opportunity, but not in a, promotion, try to get ahead sort of way, in a genuine, like, building a community of practice kind of way. And so I was doing an IMLS review grant, I'm pretty sure, with you and Riddell Hearn. And during that time, one or both of you were talking about AAAM and being on the board. And so I think that's how I got recruited to be on the board with you all. And I'm sure others who have been part of the oral histories as well, Kelly Willits being one. And so I was on the board for a couple of years. I forget now how many. I was the secretary of AAAM for a minute as well. And I think in that particular moment, as you'll see in connection to the organizations that I've worked with, I feel like I was with AAAM during a time of transition. And so there was a lot going on the board. There was a lot going on with the organization. It was before an ED had been hired, but we were in the process of that. We had gotten this IMLS grant. We were doing a survey, right? There were a lot of things happening. And I like to think that I was a part of the change, even though I don't necessarily feel like I saw it all the way through fruition, right? What is happening in AAAM now are fruits of those labor, but I'm really excited to be sort of witnessing what's happening in this moment, because I think there's so much growth and so much flourishing right now.
Who are some of the people who've influenced you most in AAAM and the Black Museum field?
Oh, so hard to just name a couple. I already said Riddell and Kelly. I think that we still are very connected. Ahmad Ward is someone I respect so much from historic Freedom Park, historic Mitchellville Freedom Park. I don't know that he is currently around so much, but Spencer Crew was at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center as I was coming on. So he has always been someone I've connected with and looked up to. John Fleming is on AASLH Council with me now. And so we also knew each other during AAAM. Lonnie Bunch is in that similar boat as well. So there are so many names. Kinshasa, I think there are so many people who I have admired and have been able to touch in these moments. But if I didn't mention the folks, Lanisha DeBartolabin, she was on board with us as well. The people who were on AAAM board with me in those moments, I still treasure so much for all that they're doing.
And Lanisha is our current president of the board. And I'm walking in your footsteps as the board secretary these days. So the minutes look very much like the ones that you produced. You provided the framework. You were certainly an important part of the evolution of AAAM and its transition to where it is now with 1,000+ members today, which is pretty remarkable when you consider where it was when we were first on the board together. What's your vision for the future of the field and the organization?
I think that my vision for the future of the field is that museums generally get to be who they are and worry less about the colonial structures, right, that they have been. I think that sometimes when we're thinking about Black museums and Indigenous museums, that they have been held to this white standard or have held themselves to this white standard. And I'd like to continue seeing museums and historic sites breaking out of that mold and getting recognition for doing that. I think that's really important. From an individual point of view, I would love, however far my vision is going, that people can no longer say, I can't find any qualified candidates of color, right? I'm tired of hearing that. So I want it to be true that just can't even come out of someone's mouth anymore from an individual level. And so I think that takes a strong pipeline. I think it takes a lot of courage. Those of us who are in majority white organizations are really integrating them, right? Which can be really difficult. And so keeping that in mind. And I think for AAAM, my vision for AAAM is to be a powerhouse in terms of these associations. I'm currently on the board of the American Alliance of Museums, currently on the board of AASLH, and I know how much they talk together and how much things get done sort of behind the scenes, right? And certainly AAAM has been a part of that, but I don't just want AAAM to be invited to the table. I want AAAM to be inviting others to the table, right? That we switch that dynamic around. And I'm really excited about how much support Lonnie Bunch in particular has given to AAAM, how much support IMLS has given. And I think that will only strengthen this position. So that's my hope for AAAM, for the field, and for individuals in the field.
So you mentioned that you want to get to a point where people aren't saying that they can't find any qualified applicants, particularly from people of color. So what are your recommendations for people who want to enter this field?
Mm-hmm. When I think about people who want to enter this field, I think of a couple of different things. So one, don't let anyone tell you that you have to take, this tried and true traditional path. Generally speaking, I don't know very many museum people who have followed a particular path, right? We all came from different places. So just stand strong in that and think about your transferable skills. I also think that is particularly in this moment, don't sell yourself short, right? Again, so many folks are like, you have to volunteer, you have to start at the bottom and work your way up. There's such a vacuum right now, right? That I think that we can make some asks that we weren't able to make before. So don't just automatically assume that you have to start at the bottom and work your way up. I think that if I could say to students, not to scare people or warn people, but I think that we need to also have more conversations about what it means to work in these spaces, right? Whether it's like the Freedom Center and it's a majority Black space, what that looks like, or the National Civil Rights Museum, right? Whether it's a place like that, or it's a place like the Guggenheim Art Museum, right? That when we are considering what organizations we're working in, there are challenges regardless. And I would like to have more conversations with students about what integrating these places looks like and feels like, because I'm not sure that we've prepared, again, particularly students of color, to walk into these spaces and to break down some of those barriers.
All right, last question. Just wondering what you think the future holds for you right now in this work, and any closing comments that you might have.
Mm. When I think about myself, you will not be surprised that I am already thinking about what I can do next, right? So I think I've lived in Atlanta for 7 years, which is the longest I've ever lived in a city as an adult. I have been working again at consulting since 2016. It's shifted a bit over the years, but concertedly doing kind of the focus with those new museums. It will be 2 years in March. I started right before the pandemic, kind of that time around. So I'm getting tired of that. I always am looking for a new thing or a new challenge. I'm thinking about leaning into a little bit this idea of coaching and working with people. So whether they're individuals or whether they're cohorts from a particular organization, but beginning to really focus on those individuals and the needs that individuals have as leaders, as change makers, as opposed to just focusing on the big sort of systemic organizational pieces. And so we'll see that, I said March would be my 2-year mark. That's about the length of my focus. I have a lot of projects that will be wrapping up in June of 2022. So I might take some time off in July and then still consult, but think of some new venture for the fall of 2022. And if I could give advice, my advice, I think, to students and to others is just to continue to reach out. That I was saying, the people on the board of AAAM, the people that I've met along the way, we all support and need each other. And it's a small world, right? And so I can still call up somebody and see if they have work, or call up somebody and make a recommendation on behalf of an applicant. And so I think building that network, that community of practice, is really important, especially for those who are newer to the field. You might think that someone won't reply to your email, or someone won't have a Zoom coffee with you. My experience is that most people do, right? If they have the time, if they have the bandwidth, people want to talk to you, people want to help you, people want to stay in touch. And so lean into that. It might be a little scary during some of those cold calls, but more often than not, people will make space for you.
Dina Bailey, thank you very much for this. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm grateful for you.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you, to catch up, and I wish the best for all of your students.
Thanks.